The capacity of American military forces to adapt and innovate during the Second World War stands as one of the most remarkable organizational achievements in modern military history. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States transformed from a nation with the world's 18th largest army into a military juggernaut that could project power across two oceans simultaneously, outproducing the combined industrial output of all Axis powers while developing tactical and operational doctrines that would shape warfare for generations. This transformation did not occur through inherent American exceptionalism or superior martial spirit, but rather through a complex interplay of institutional structures, industrial capacity, cultural factors, and pragmatic problem-solving that distinguished the American approach to warfare from that of its allies and enemies alike. Understanding why American forces adapted faster than other Allied armies requires examining not merely battlefield innovations, but the entire ecosystem of military culture, training systems, industrial organization, and command philosophy that enabled rapid learning and implementation of lessons from combat. The story begins, not in 1941 with Pearl Harbor, but in the interwar period when the foundations for this adaptive capacity were being laid, often unintentionally, within American military institutions and the broader society that would supply both soldiers and materiel for the coming conflict. The United States Army of 1939 numbered fewer than 200,000 men, ranking behind Romania in size, equipped with obsolete weapons and possessing virtually no modern armored or mechanized forces. The Army Air Corps flew aircraft that would be obsolete within 2 years. The Marine Corps, though it had developed amphibious warfare doctrine throughout the 1930s, lacked the specialized equipment to implement its theories. The Navy, while substantial, adhered to battleship-centric doctrine that the coming war would rapidly render obsolete. Yet within this unprepared military establishment existed institutional characteristics that would prove crucial for rapid adaptation. The American military tradition, unlike European armies with their aristocratic officer corps and rigid class structures, had always maintained a more egalitarian and pragmatic approach to military service. Officers were expected to demonstrate competence rather than breeding, and the citizen-soldier tradition meant that civilian skills and perspectives constantly flowed into military service. This would prove transformative when mobilization brought millions of Americans with technical, managerial, and organizational expertise into uniform. The interwar army, despite its small size and limited funding, had maintained professional military education programs at Fort Leavenworth and the Army War College that emphasized problem-solving and mission-oriented tactics rather than rote memorization of doctrine. German military theorists who studied American methods noted with some puzzlement that American officers were trained to question orders and seek alternative solutions, a practice that would have been considered insubordination in more rigid military systems. When mobilization began in 1940, following the fall of France, the expansion of American forces occurred at a pace unprecedented in history. The army grew from 200,000 to over 8 million men in less than 4 years. This explosive growth, while creating enormous challenges, also meant that the military was not bound by decades of accumulated tradition and ossified thinking. New divisions were being created constantly, which meant new commanders had to be appointed, new staff officers trained, and new organizational structures developed without the weight of institutional inertia that burdened older armies. The selection and promotion of officers during this expansion revealed another crucial factor in American adaptability. While European armies including those of allied nations, maintained promotion systems based heavily on seniority and often on social class. American forces promoted based on demonstrated ability with a speed that shocked foreign observers. George Marshall, who became Army Chief of Staff in 1939, ruthlessly removed officers he deemed inadequate regardless of their seniority or connections, retiring hundreds of senior officers and promoting younger men based on their performance in training and early operations. Marshall's influence on creating an adaptive military cannot be overstated. He insisted that officers be rotated through different assignments to broaden their experience, that promising commanders be given responsibility beyond their years, and that failure in training be treated as a learning opportunity rather than a career-ending disaster. When the Army began conducting large-scale maneuvers in Louisiana and the Carolinas in 1940 and 1941, Marshall ensured that after-action reviews were conducted with brutal honesty, that mistakes were documented and disseminated throughout the force, and that commanders who showed initiative and tactical acumen were identified for rapid advancement. The Louisiana maneuvers of 1941, which involved over 400,000 troops, served as a vast laboratory for testing doctrine, equipment, and leaders. The exercises revealed that American tanks were inadequate, that anti-tank doctrine was flawed, that communications equipment was insufficient, and that many senior commanders were unsuited for mobile warfare. Rather than suppressing these findings, the Army used them to drive immediate changes in equipment procurement, tactical doctrine, and personnel assignments. Dwight Eisenhower, then a lieutenant colonel serving as Chief of Staff for the Third Army during the maneuvers, attracted Marshall's attention through his innovative planning and cool judgment, leading to his selection for rapid promotion and eventual command of Allied forces in Europe. The industrial dimension of American adaptability proved equally important. When war came, American industry possessed characteristics that made rapid innovation possible. Unlike the more cartelized and government-controlled industries of other nations, American manufacturing maintained fierce competition that drove constant improvement. The automotive industry, which would produce the majority of American military vehicles, had spent decades refining mass production techniques and developing flexible manufacturing systems that could rapidly switch between product lines. When the War Department needed to produce tens of thousands of tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles, these techniques were immediately applicable. The relationship between military planners and industrial producers in America also differed from other nations. Rather than the government dictating designs that industry would produce, American practice involved extensive collaboration between military users, engineers, and manufacturers. When early combat reports from North Africa revealed that American tanks were outclassed by German armor, the response involved not just military planners, but automotive engineers, metallurgists, and industrial designers working together to develop solutions. The Sherman tank, often criticized for its inadequacies against German heavy armor, exemplified American pragmatism. It was not designed to be the best tank on the battlefield, but rather to be good enough, produced in sufficient quantity, easily maintained by minimally trained crews, and simple enough to be manufactured by automotive plants with minimal retooling. This approach, which prioritized practicality over perfection, allowed American forces to field armored divisions in numbers that overwhelmed Axis forces, despite individual technical disadvantages. The decision-making process within American military commands reflected a fundamentally different command philosophy than that of other armies. Where British forces maintained a system of detailed orders that prescribed specific actions, and Soviet forces employed rigid centralized control, American doctrine embraced what would later be termed mission-type orders. Commanders were given objectives and resources, but were expected to determine the means of accomplishing missions themselves. This approach required better educated and more initiative-oriented junior officers and non-commissioned officers, but it enabled rapid response to changing battlefield conditions without waiting for instructions from higher headquarters. The development of this decentralized command style owed much to American civilian business practices. Many officers who received commissions during mobilization brought with them experience from corporations that had already adopted decentralized management structures. The idea that subordinates should have the authority to make decisions within their sphere of responsibility was familiar to men who had worked in companies like General Motors or DuPont. When these civilian managers became military officers, they brought these organizational principles with them. Training systems developed during American mobilization also contributed to rapid adaptation. Unlike armies that trained soldiers in specific tasks and expected them to perform those tasks identically regardless of circumstances, American training increasingly emphasized problem-solving and initiative. Infantry training included not just marksmanship and close-order drill, but map reading, small unit tactics, and the expectation that junior leaders would need to make independent decisions in combat. This approach required more time and resources than simpler training methods, but it produced soldiers better equipped to handle the chaos and uncertainty of modern warfare. The establishment of specialized training centers for different combat arms allowed rapid dissemination of lessons learned from combat. The Desert Training Center in California and Arizona, established in 1942, covered an area larger than the state of Connecticut and allowed American forces to train for combat in North Africa under realistic conditions. When divisions completed training there and deployed to combat, their experiences were documented, analyzed, and incorporated into training programs for subsequent units. This cycle of learning occurred with remarkable speed compared to other armies. The Army Ground Forces, established in 1942 under General Leslie McNair, served as the institutional mechanism for implementing lessons from combat into training and doctrine. McNair insisted on realistic training that replicated combat conditions as closely as possible, including the use of live ammunition, despite the inevitable training casualties this produced. He also established a system for collecting combat lessons from the field, analyzing them systematically, and distributing the findings throughout the training establishment. This institutional learning mechanism operated with a speed and efficiency that other armies struggled to match. When American forces entered combat in North Africa in November 1942, they were immediately tested against veteran German and Italian forces. The initial results were often humiliating. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces under Erwin Rommel inflicted a sharp defeat on American troops, revealing numerous deficiencies in training, leadership, and doctrine. The American response to this defeat exemplified the adaptive capacity that would characterize their performance throughout the war. Rather than minimizing the failure or seeking scapegoats, commanders conducted thorough analyses of what had gone wrong. Eisenhower removed commanders he deemed inadequate, including the Second Corps commander, and appointed George Patton to restore the unit's fighting capability. Within weeks, changes were implemented throughout American forces in North Africa based on lessons from Kasserine. Infantry tactics were modified to emphasize combined arms coordination. Tank destroyer doctrine, which had proven ineffective, was revised. Artillery procedures were improved to provide more responsive fire support. Communications procedures were streamlined. These changes were not merely recommended, but were actually implemented at the unit level with remarkable speed. By the time American forces participated in the final offensive in Tunisia 2 months after Khe Sanh, they had become significantly more effective, demonstrating an organizational learning curve that German commanders found surprising. The Tunisia campaign also revealed the importance of American logistical capabilities in enabling adaptation. American forces operated with a logistical abundance that allowed them to experiment with different approaches without worrying about resource constraints. When a tactical method proved ineffective, they could try alternatives without the desperate concern for ammunition or fuel expenditure that constrained Axis forces. This logistical superiority derived not just from American industrial capacity, but from organizational systems that prioritize supply and maintenance. The Services of Supply, later renamed Army Service Forces, developed distribution systems that could deliver extraordinary quantities of materiel to combat units with impressive efficiency. The development of air power doctrine illustrated American adaptability in action. When the war began, American strategic bombing theory, developed at the Air Corps Tactical School during the 1930s, emphasized precision daylight bombing of specific industrial targets to destroy an enemy's capacity to wage war. Early raids over Europe revealed that this doctrine encountered serious practical difficulties. German fighter defenses and anti-aircraft artillery inflicted prohibitive losses on unescorted bomber formations. Bombing accuracy proved far lower than theorists had assumed. Weather conditions frequently prevented visual bombing entirely. Rather than abandoning strategic bombing or continuing with methods that were proving ineffective, American air commanders adapted their approach. They developed long-range fighter escorts, first with drop tanks on existing fighters, and later with the P-51 Mustang designed specifically for this role. They refined bomber formations to provide better defensive firepower. They developed radar bombing techniques for operations when visual bombing was impossible. They shifted target priorities based on actual effects rather than pre-war theory. This adaptive process occurred through constant analysis of mission results and systematic implementation of improvements. The operational research methods that American forces employed represented another dimension of adaptive capacity. The Army and Navy established analytical sections staffed with scientists, mathematicians, and engineers to study combat operations and recommend improvements. These operational research groups analyzed everything from the optimal pattern for anti-submarine patrols to the most effective ammunition mix for fighter aircraft. Their recommendations, based on statistical analysis rather than tradition or intuition, often challenged conventional wisdom but frequently led to significant improvements in effectiveness. The contrasts with Allied armies illuminate the distinctive characteristics of American adaptation. British forces, despite their extensive combat experience, operated within more rigid organizational structures that made change more difficult. The British Army maintained a regimental system that, while fostering unit cohesion and tradition, also created barriers to disseminating lessons across the force. Officers belonged to regiments rather than to the army as a whole, which meant that innovations in one unit might never spread to others. British doctrine development moved through more formal channels that required approval at higher levels, slowing implementation of tactical improvements. The British approach to armor employment exemplified these difficulties. Despite pioneering tank warfare in World War I and maintaining substantial armored forces throughout the interwar period, British doctrine struggled to resolve debates about the proper employment of tanks. Should armor operate independently or support infantry? Should tank units be specialized for different roles or standardized? These doctrinal questions remained contentious throughout the war, with different commanders implementing different approaches, making it difficult to develop institutional expertise or standard operating procedures. Soviet forces adapted extensively during the war, recovering from catastrophic defeats in 1941 to develop formidable military capabilities by 1944. However, Soviet adaptation operated differently than American methods. The Red Army learned primarily through survival necessity under conditions of existential crisis. Changes in doctrine and organization came through directives from the very top of a rigidly hierarchical system. Junior officers and soldiers were given little initiative, and tactical flexibility remained limited even as operational capabilities improved. Soviet adaptation focused on developing a few proven methods and executing them with overwhelming force rather than the more varied and flexible approach characteristic of American forces. Soviet tank design illustrated this philosophical difference. While American tanks emphasized mechanical reliability and ease of production and maintenance, accepting technical inferiority to German designs, Soviet tanks like the T-34 pushed technical performance even at the cost of crew comfort and mechanical reliability. This reflected different strategic calculations. Soviet forces operated close to their industrial base with shorter supply lines, making maintenance less critical. They also accepted higher casualty rates, both mechanical and human, in pursuit of tactical performance. American forces, operating at the end of transoceanic supply lines, required equipment that could be maintained by conscript soldiers with limited training, leading to different design priorities. The integration of technology into combat operations revealed American advantages in both innovation and implementation. The development of the proximity fuse for anti-aircraft artillery represented a technological breakthrough that dramatically improved the effectiveness of defensive fire against aircraft. Developed by American scientists and engineers, the proximity fuse used a miniature radar to detonate shells near aircraft without requiring direct hits. Introducing this technology into combat use required not just technical development, but also training programs for artillery crews, secure procedures to prevent the technology from falling into enemy hands, and integration with existing fire control systems. American forces accomplished this process with remarkable speed, fielding proximity-fused ammunition in anti-aircraft units by 1943 and eventually adapting the technology for use against ground targets in artillery fire. The development of airborne forces demonstrated American willingness to invest heavily in new capabilities despite initial setbacks. After observing German airborne operations in Crete, American planners decided to develop their own airborne forces. The initial effort faced numerous challenges, including aircraft shortages, inadequate parachute equipment, and doctrinal uncertainty about how airborne forces should be employed. Rather than abandoning the concept after early difficulties, American planners committed substantial resources to developing doctrine, equipment, and training programs. When American airborne forces were first employed in combat in Sicily in July 1943, the results were mixed. Many paratroopers were scattered far from their objectives. Friendly fire from naval vessels caused casualties, and coordination with ground forces proved difficult. However, subsequent operations in Normandy, Holland, and Germany showed progressive improvement as lessons were incorporated into planning and execution. The naval dimension of American adaptation deserves particular attention. The United States Navy entered the war with a battleship-centric doctrine that was rendered obsolete by the first 6 months of fighting. The Pearl Harbor attack demonstrated the vulnerability of battleships to air attack. The carrier battles of Coral Sea and Midway in 1942 established that naval supremacy in the Pacific would be determined by carrier-based aviation. American naval leadership adapted to these new realities with impressive speed. Resources were redirected from battleship construction to carriers. Doctrine was rewritten to emphasize carrier operations. Training programs were expanded dramatically to provide the pilots and aircrew needed for expanded carrier air groups. The development of Carrier Task Force doctrine represented organizational innovation of a high order. Rather than operating carriers individually or in small groups as Japanese doctrine prescribed, American forces developed the Fast Carrier Task Force concept that concentrated multiple carriers with supporting vessels into powerful formations capable of projecting air power across vast distances while defending themselves against enemy attack. This doctrine emerged not from pre-war planning, but from operational experience, particularly the lessons of the 1942 carrier battles. American forces also demonstrated superior ability to incorporate technological improvements into existing systems. Radar, which all major combatants developed during the war, was integrated into American ships and aircraft more extensively and effectively than in other navies. American ships carried multiple radar systems for different purposes. Search radars to detect enemy forces at long range, fire control radars to direct gunnery, and fighter control radars to direct combat air patrols against incoming attacks. The sophistication of American radar systems and the training of personnel to exploit them gave American forces significant tactical advantages in naval combat. The submarine campaign against Japan illustrated adaptive innovation in a different context. American submarines entered the war with defective torpedoes that often failed to detonate or ran at incorrect depths. This technical failure, compounded by peacetime torpedo testing that had failed to reveal these flaws, seriously hampered submarine effectiveness during the first 18 months of the war. The institutional response to this problem revealed both weaknesses and strengths in American military organization. Initially, submarine commanders who reported torpedo problems were not believed by the Bureau of Ordnance, which insisted that the torpedoes were functioning correctly and that failures must result from operator error. This bureaucratic resistance delayed solutions for many months. However, once the problems were definitively proven through systematic testing, corrections were implemented rapidly and completely. By 1943, American submarines were operating with reliable torpedoes and had developed tactics that made them devastatingly effective against Japanese merchant shipping. The evolution of amphibious warfare doctrine and capabilities represented perhaps the most complex adaptive challenge American forces faced. Amphibious operations, which would be essential for victory in both the Pacific and European theaters, required coordination between services, specialized equipment, innovative tactics, and extensive training. While the Marine Corps had developed theoretical doctrine for amphibious operations during the interwar period, the practical requirements of conducting opposed landings against prepared defenses had to be learned through experience. Early operations at Guadalcanal and North Africa revealed numerous deficiencies. Specialized landing craft were in short supply, naval gunfire support procedures were inadequate, command and control systems broke down during ship-to-shore movement, supply operations struggled to move material across beaches, air support coordination needed improvement. Rather than accepting these problems as inherent limitations of amphibious warfare, American forces systematically addressed each deficiency. The development of specialized landing craft proceeded through multiple iterations. The Higgins boat became the standard infantry landing craft. Larger LSTS were designed to transport tanks and vehicles directly onto beaches. Specialized vessels were developed for different purposes: command ships with advanced communications, fire support ships with rockets for saturation bombardment, and repair ships to maintain equipment in forward areas. The industrial capacity to produce these specialized vessels in large numbers gave American forces capabilities that other armies could not match. Tactical innovations in amphibious operations emerged from combat experience. The use of naval gunfire and aerial bombardment to suppress beach defenses before landings became standard procedure, with timing and intensity refined through successive operations. The discovery that prolonged bombardment could destroy fortifications, but also eliminated the element of surprise, led to debates about the proper balance that continued throughout the war. Different commanders reached different conclusions, with some favoring surprise and others overwhelming firepower. But the existence of this debate and the willingness to experiment with different approaches itself reflected adaptive capacity. The development of specialized combat units for specific missions exemplified American willingness to innovate organizationally. Ranger battalions were created for raiding operations and difficult missions. Engineers were organized into specialized combat engineer battalions that could conduct demolitions, clear obstacles, and perform construction under fire. Tank destroyer battalions, though their original doctrine proved flawed, were adapted to provide mobile anti-tank defense and fire support. Chemical mortar battalions provided indirect fire support with smoke and high explosive rounds. These specialized units could be attached to divisions as needed, providing flexibility that more rigidly organized armies lacked. Training and personnel replacement systems evolved significantly during the war. The early system, which trained individual replacements and sent them forward to fill vacancies in combat units, proved to have serious shortcomings. Replacements arriving at units with no prior connection to their comrades and no familiarity with unit procedures suffered disproportionate casualties and took longer to become effective. In response, the Army modified its system to provide some unit training for replacement groups before they deployed, and to create mechanisms for integrating replacements more effectively, while never fully resolving all the problems of the replacement system. These adjustments demonstrated willingness to modify established procedures when they proved inadequate. The performance of American forces in the European campaign from Normandy to Germany showed the cumulative effects of this adaptive capacity. The Normandy invasion succeeded not just through overwhelming force, but through meticulous planning that incorporated lessons from earlier amphibious operations. When American forces became bogged down in the Normandy hedgerows, where the bocage terrain negated advantages in mobility and firepower, tactical innovations emerged from within combat units. The most famous innovation, the rhinoceros hedgerow cutter, developed by Sergeant Curtis Cullen, involved welding steel prongs onto tank fronts to cut through hedgerows rather than climbing over them. This device, improvised in the field and rapidly distributed throughout armored units, exemplified bottom-up innovation enabled by a command structure that encouraged initiative. The pursuit across France in August 1944 demonstrated American logistical capabilities stretched to their limits. Patton's Third Army advanced so rapidly that it outran its supply lines, leading to operational pauses while logistics caught up. The logistical system, rather than breaking under these extraordinary demands, adapted by implementing the Red Ball Express, a dedicated truck supply route that operated around the clock to move supplies forward. This improvised system despite its inefficiencies, kept advancing armies supplied well enough to maintain momentum. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 tested American adaptive capacity under crisis conditions. The German offensive achieved complete tactical surprise and created a dangerous situation that threatened Allied plans. The American response demonstrated not just tactical flexibility, but institutional responsiveness. Eisenhower immediately recognized the German attack as an opportunity rather than just a threat, concentrating forces to contain the penetration while planning counteroffensives to destroy German forces extended beyond their supply lines. Subordinate commanders like Patton demonstrated operational flexibility by rapidly shifting their forces from offensive operations in one sector to defensive positions and counterattacks in another. The speed with which entire divisions changed direction and moved to new positions exceeded what German planners had thought possible. At the tactical level, isolated American units like the defenders of Bastogne showed the effectiveness of training that emphasized initiative and independent action. Surrounded and outnumbered, these forces held critical road junctions and disrupted German timetables long enough for reinforcements to arrive. This performance resulted not from superior soldiers or equipment, but from training and doctrine that prepared junior leaders to operate effectively without constant direction from higher headquarters. The final campaigns into Germany in 1945 showcased American forces operating with high proficiency across the full spectrum of military operations. River crossings, urban combat, pursuit operations, and the encirclement of German armies were executed with a combination of firepower, mobility, and tactical skill that reflected cumulative learning from nearly 4 years of combat. The contrast with the inexperienced forces that had struggled at Khe Sanh Pass 2 years earlier was striking. In the Pacific Theater, American adaptive capacity manifested somewhat differently due to the unique characteristics of that conflict. Island warfare required specialized tactics and equipment that had no precedent in American military experience. The evolution of Pacific operations from the costly frontal assaults at Tarawa in November 1943 to the more sophisticated operations at Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa showed progressive refinement of amphibious tactics, though never eliminating the fundamental difficulty and cost of attacking fortified islands. Naval aviation in the Pacific demonstrated perhaps the most dramatic adaptive improvements. American carrier forces in 1942 operated with limited numbers of obsolete aircraft and still developing tactics. By 1944, American carriers had grown larger and more numerous, embarked modern aircraft in greater numbers, and employed refined doctrines that made them devastatingly effective. The Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944, where American carrier aircraft destroyed hundreds of Japanese planes while suffering minimal losses, demonstrated the cumulative effect of better aircraft, better training, better tactics, and better supporting technology like radar. The integration of lessons across theaters occurred through formal and informal mechanisms. Officers rotated between theaters, bringing experience from one front to another. Written reports from combat operations were distributed widely. Training centers incorporated lessons from both Europe and the Pacific. Weapons and equipment developments were shared between theaters when applicable. This cross-pollination of experience enabled American forces to avoid learning the same lessons twice in different locations. The institutional mechanisms that enabled American adaptation extended beyond military organizations to include civilian agencies and industrial firms. The Office of Scientific Research and Development, headed by Vannevar Bush, mobilized American scientific expertise for military applications, developing technologies ranging from radar improvements to proximity fuses to medical advances. The War Production Board coordinated industrial output and resolved competing demands for resources. The Office of Strategic Services developed intelligence capabilities and special operations forces. These civilian agencies worked in close cooperation with military organizations, creating an integrated civil-military system for innovation and problem-solving that exceeded what other nations achieved. The cultural factors underlying American adaptability deserve consideration beyond just institutional mechanisms. American society in the early 20th century had developed characteristics that translated effectively to military operations. The educational system, while uneven in quality, provided broader basic education than most other societies, producing conscripts who could read complex technical manuals, perform mathematical calculations, and understand mechanical systems. The automotive society meant that most American men had experience maintaining and repairing machinery, making them better suited to operating and maintaining complex military equipment. The industrial workplace had familiarized millions of Americans with large organizations, standardized procedures, and hierarchical management, easing their transition to military service. The relatively egalitarian character of American society, compared to the more class-bound societies of Europe, meant that talent could emerge from any background. Some of the most effective American commanders came from modest circumstances. Eisenhower was the son of a Kansas mechanic. Bradley was the son of a Missouri schoolteacher. Many successful officers had worked their way through college or attended service academies based on merit rather than social connections. This social mobility meant that the officer corps included a broader range of perspectives and experiences than in armies where officers came predominantly from aristocratic classes. The question of why American forces adapted faster than other Allied armies does not have a single simple answer, but rather emerges from the convergence of multiple factors. Superior industrial capacity provided the resources for experimentation and innovation without existential resource constraints. Organizational structures that encouraged initiative and decentralized decision-making enabled rapid implementation of tactical improvements. Personnel systems that promoted based on merit rather than seniority placed competent commanders in positions of responsibility. Training systems that emphasized problem-solving rather than rote procedures produced soldiers and officers capable of adapting to unexpected situations. Scientific and industrial mobilization provided technological advantages and the means to translate innovations into fielded equipment. Cultural factors, including educational levels, mechanical aptitude, and social mobility, contributed to creating effective military forces from civilian conscripts. The contrast with Britain reveals how even allies facing the same enemy and sharing intelligence developed differently. Britain's longer experience with modern warfare paradoxically became a disadvantage in some respects, as established procedures and institutions resisted change. British industrial capacity, while substantial, was smaller and more constrained than American industry, limiting experimentation. Social structures remained more rigid, with class distinctions affecting both officer selection and the implementation of innovations. Soviet adaptation operated under entirely different conditions and constraints, making direct comparison difficult. The Red Army's learning occurred under conditions of existential crisis that drove changes through harsh necessity rather than systematic institutional learning. Soviet industrial and technological capacity, while impressive in certain areas, lagged behind American capabilities in many fields, particularly in the sophisticated technologies that enabled American tactical advantages. The political system's rigid control extended to military organizations, preventing the kind of bottom-up innovation that characterized American forces. The verdict of history has largely confirmed the effectiveness of American military adaptation during World War II. The armed forces that demobilized in 1945 bore little resemblance to the unprepared military of 1940, except in the continuity of their institutional structures and cultural characteristics. They had learned to conduct operations across the full spectrum of warfare, from submarine campaigns to strategic bombing, to amphibious assaults, to armored maneuver, to urban combat. They had developed technological advantages in numerous fields. They had created logistical systems capable of supporting operations across two oceans simultaneously. They had proven capable of learning from defeats and exploiting victories. This adaptive capacity shaped the post-war world. The American military establishment that emerged from World War II became the model for modern military forces. The training methods, organizational structures, and operational doctrines developed during the war influenced military forces globally. The emphasis on technological superiority, logistical sustainability, and flexible doctrine became hallmarks of American military power that persisted through subsequent decades. The lessons of World War II regarding military adaptation remain relevant. Organizations learn not through some mystical process, but through concrete mechanisms, systematic collection and analysis of operational experience, rapid dissemination of lessons, institutional structures that enable change, personnel systems that reward competence and initiative, and cultures that value problem-solving over adherence to established procedures. The specific forms these mechanisms take will differ across time and context, but the underlying principles of organizational learning that enabled American success in World War II continue to distinguish more adaptive military forces from less adaptive ones. Understanding this history matters not for celebrating American exceptionalism, but for recognizing that adaptive capacity results from specific institutional choices and organizational characteristics that can be analyzed and potentially replicated. The United States military did not adapt faster because Americans possessed superior martial virtues or national characteristics, but because its institutions, processes, and cultures created conditions favorable to rapid learning and change. These conditions emerged from complex interactions between military organizations, industrial systems, educational institutions, and social structures. The study of this adaptation, therefore, illuminates not just military history, but organizational behavior, institutional design, and the factors that enable or inhibit change in large, complex organizations operating under conditions of extreme stress and uncertainty.